summer. If you have extremely cold winter at points, they stand out. And we have to be careful just how close of a connection we draw between individual events and the long-term changes. And so there's a certain degree of moderation and interpretation and not rushing to conclusions for whatever particular end you're interested in with respect to individual events.
So one of the earlier talks in this series was about the Belt and Road Initiative, and we haven't talked about it today, but I think it is important to realize that much of the investment that is occurring in the Belt and Road Initiative right now is investment in coal-fired power plants. So in fact, China may be working to cut down on its domestic sources of consumption of coal, but indirectly it is in fact funding significant amounts of coal-fired power over the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's going to happen in the Belt and Road Initiative is also clearly an issue in terms of climate change. And one of the questions is, what is actually going on here? Is it that as China is cutting down on its consumption of coal, there's a large number of people involved in the coal industry that could be out of work. Is this an opportunity to provide them with opportunities for employment in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, even in East Africa? So that's another issue that I think is worth having a serious conversation about in the future. We have about another, yes.
Is climate change changing the currents, the worldwide currents?
In the atmosphere and the ocean, or which one are you more particularly interested in? Okay. Steve, you want to go? No?
Not me.
Okay. Yes, I mean, climate change is changing everything, and the question is how much and how detectable is it? With respect to overall atmospheric circulation, we see small changes in the location of the tropical circulation patterns, in particular with something called the intertropical convergence zone. That's because the northern hemisphere is heating more than the southern hemisphere, and you get a shift northward. That's what the models predict, and there's some evidence that we can observe it. With regard to weather patterns that we're seeing here in the mid-latitudes, which are associated with the atmospheric jet, mid-latitude jet, that's a really contentious subject, and the scientific community speaks forcefully to both sides. I think it's too early to tell, but there could be changes there, and if it does change, there'll be implications for the variability associated with climate. And so in many ways, it's that second order issue. It's not just the change in the mean, but will the variability around that mean in some way change as well? And that's important. It's an open question. I don't have a clear answer for you at this point. With regard to ocean circulation, if the winds change, the ocean circulation changes. If the density of the surface ocean changes, the ocean circulation changes. And both of those things are happening because of changes in the winds, as I noted, but also changes in the precipitation and in terms of melting from ice sheets. And the big question is, how important are those changes? Changes in ocean circulation could have implications for overall temperatures, say in the North Atlantic, is often spoken about. And there again, I would really defer that to a subject that is an ongoing debate within the scientific community that we don't really have good, clear, simple answers for at this point.
Yes. Back row.
Okay, Stefan Hübner, I'm visiting scholar at the Asia Center. I think I didn't mention that. I have a question regarding the last presentation by Michael McElroy. You talked a lot about offshore wind energy generation. I think in the last 5-year plan, the target was something like 5 gigawatt, which is actually quite low compared to onshore wind energy generation, solar energy generation, and so on. Even though actually places like waters of Shanghai or Bohai Sea and so on are actually quite close to the big urban centers of China compared, for example, to China's north. So the distance is not really the problem here. So what do you actually identify as the reason why this is compared to other forms of energy generation not really taking off as quickly as it could if there's so much potential? And the second question would be there's a lot of plans to cover the surfaces of lakes with solar arrays. So solar energy on lakes is quite an important topic by now. Do you see any potential to do this on the surface of the ocean in the near future? Is this also maybe an opportunity for renewable energy generation? Thank you.
In terms of offshore wind, which I think is the most promising opportunity, why is it that the cost of offshore wind has come screaming down over the last number of years? There are several factors that are involved there. One is that we're now building larger turbines that go higher in the atmosphere and capturing more reliable winds. And that is lowering the cost. And then the other issue that's affecting the cost is, in fact, that it's become a very competitive industry. The competition to build these large turbines is global effectively, and that's a major player as well. Typical onshore wind turbines in China are about 1.5 or 2 megawatts in individual size. But General Electric, for example, is working on a prototype offshore turbine that would be as much as 12.5 megawatts. And the stuff that's going in off Massachusetts is, in fact, 8 megawatts. So that's a major consideration that is going on. And at the same time, what is happening is that, not only is the cost of wind-generated electricity offshore and onshore going down, but also the cost of solar PV in particular is also going down. So you have an interesting opportunity that the renewable sources are in fact right now cheaper than coal. If you're going to build a new coal-fired power plant, you're better to rely on wind and solar. And the challenge is, how do you make the transition from here to there? And one of the challenges we have to face is that the variability of the sources is a problem. Mating the variability of the wind and the sun solar source with demand for electricity is a significant problem. The other issue is that, of course, you're not likely to be able to fly your planes using electricity from wind and solar. So the opportunity to try to make the transition from to a more electrically driven economy is clearly important. And one of the key issues here, one of the key challenges is to find a way to store electricity. I mean, I mentioned the problem of wind in China, where in fact you're turning off the turbines because you can't actually store the electricity that would be otherwise produced. Okay, you can store electricity with batteries. That's one possibility, and there's some interesting work going on here at Harvard on trying to develop cheaper, more economically effective batteries. But I think, and also if you have more electrically driven cars with batteries, then the batteries in those cars become a distributed opportunity to store electricity. You can charge the batteries at night when the electricity is cheap, and if you don't want to drive your car on a hot summer day, you can sell the electricity back to the grid. So those are opportunities. My own view is that we actually need to move to a different view of the future, particularly in the transportation sector. Yes, we're going to have battery-driven cars, but in terms of large trucks and buses and so on and trains, batteries is not the way to go there. We need to have another way to do it. And the other way to do it is to use fuel cells and to charge the fuel cells with hydrogen, which you produce from electrolysis using carbon-free sources of electricity. And I believe that is going to be economically competitive and that it is potentially the future. And John, when he was here, mentioned the former Minister for Science and Technology in China. And he mentioned the fact that that individual had been a major proponent of battery-powered cars, and China is producing more battery-powered cars than any other country in the world at the moment. A week ago, this individual was quoted as saying that the future is fuel cells, and we need to actually get busy now on the idea of using hydrogen and fuel cells to run long-distance transportation in the future. So I really think that is happening. And interestingly enough, I think the Japanese are actually ahead of the game here in that they actually have, in fact, thought seriously about the possibility of fuel cell-driven vehicles more than we have, more than the Chinese have up to now. We're running out of juice and time. Yeah.
Briefly, you mentioned batteries, but also in China, I
super grids or so low resistance electricity.
Yeah, and that's true. And the high voltage DC connections from the Three Gorges, for example, to the coastal regions are pretty important. But it turns out that the high voltage connections don't actually solve the problem of bringing the power from the wind-rich northern plain to the coastal areas. However, bringing it onshore from offshore is pretty straightforward. If you look at the cost of offshore wind, a relatively minor part of the cost is the transport of the power from the region offshore, even as much as 100 miles away to onshore. So I think that is really an important part of the future. Actually, there's one issue that didn't come up here. The gentleman back here mentioned, the nitrogen story. Maybe I'll sort of kick this to Steve. I mean, the fact is that we are forcing the nitrogen cycle on a global basis for agricultural purpose with fertilizer, with soybeans, with nitrogen-fixing plants. And one of the consequences of that is that there is an increase in production of nitrous oxide. So the third most important greenhouse gas after CO2 and methane is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is going up like that also. So Steve, what do you think?
I think that nitrous oxide is potentially a significant issue. So when you apply fertilizer to fields, you produce it. You produce it sometimes in various wastewater type applications, landfills. So it's certainly out of balance in terms of its current rate of increase. Its current rate of increase is increasing. It's kind of a slow walker because it has a very long lifetime. And it will continue to increase in the future. So one does need to think about all of those things together. But yeah, if we all became vegetarians, as Charles suggested, this would actually improve the nitrous oxide situation as well.
Well, I'm actually worried about the nitrous oxide from 2 points of view. Okay, the climate issue is one. But of course, it also is a source of nitrogen oxides in the stratosphere that destroys ozone. And that means that there's going to be more ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface of the Earth, and people with fair skin like me are particularly vulnerable. So I'm opposed to that. If there is no further questions, we've hit the deadline. I was asked to advertise a talk that's going to be given at the Asia Center by Mr. Matsudani on the 6th of May. He is a fellow. Resident fellow at the Asia Center, and he's going to be speaking about the social cost of automobiles and environment policies in Asia, a comparative study of China and Japan. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to all of the members of the panel.
That's a short story. So let's exchange email and decide when we can do it. All right.
It would be nice to chat with you just for a few minutes.